There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and to another book haul. This one's a little bit unique in that these are books that I have retrieved from my parents' farm where I grew up. And I did a whole series of unboxing videos several years ago, 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, of books that had gone missing and were found on the farm that were among my most precious books, signed copies of this and that and so on. This is a different batch than that. About 12 days before September 11th, 2001, it's a date that sticks in my head, I picked up and moved from Edmonton, Alberta to Vancouver, British Columbia. And I took most of my books with me, but I had so many books in Edmonton that I had a separate room for overflow in the basement. And my dad and mom, especially my dad, said, "Do you really need to take all these books? Do you really? Can't you weed some of them out, send them home to the farm?" So I went through my shelves and I culled about 3, maybe 4 huge boxes of books that I didn't think I'd be reading or wanting to consult anytime in the next decade. And they went home to the farm and I never saw them again. Didn't need to find them for a long time, but you know, over the years, certain books I think, oh, I think it's one of those. I think that's in this batch of books that went home to the farm in 2001. And so I finally found them about a year ago, and this summer I went through them looking for a particular book or two and pulled a bunch that I need very urgently to have on my shelf again for the first time in 22 years. So a lot of these books I'd forgotten I had or, whatever, and am now interested anew in the ones I'm about to show you. There's a lot of Western Canadian lit here, but there's much more than that. So that's what this book haul is about. And after pulling these books and bringing them here, I haven't looked at them for a couple of months. So it's going to be all like Christmas for me, just showing them to you and getting reacquainted with them. So let's get started. The first one I have shown on a couple videos already. This is a children's novel that I read and loved as a kid, The Greatest Gresham by Gillian Avery. And all I remember about it is that I loved it. And I've thought about it for some reason often over the years. Couldn't afford to get a replacement copy. And so I was delighted to find out that I had kept it. And as I have shown every time I've put it on my channel, there's my library stamp that my grandparents got me for Christmas. And I belong to a postal book club. I think everybody was in Saskatchewan. And we mailed the book around, and there was a note paper. Everybody gave their comments. I wish I still had that. And there I am, Sean Mooney, age 12. So that would have been 1978. Anyway, this book was originally published in 1962. Let's listen to the opening paragraph, shall we? The Gresham children were, so their father continually assured them, heirs to a great name. It was up to them, he would add, to do something about it, and add honor to the name of Gresham. Future generations looked to them. But he never told them what they should do, and on the occasions when those pronouncements were made, it was usually over the Sunday dinner table, because this was one of the few meals of the week that he was able to take with the children, Henry would look uneasily at his plate, feeling that it was probably a reproach because he had not eaten the fat off his mutton, while Amy, the youngest of the family, would sit calm and impassive. She had a great gift for letting things that people said flow past her. Besides, she was not in the least troubled by the responsibility of upholding the Gresham name. It never occurred to her that there was any difficulty in it at all. Well, I absolutely love that opening paragraph. Of course, I have no memory of it, but I think I'm going to reread this one fairly soon, and it's part of a series. I don't know if I ever knew that when I was a kid, but I've Googled Gillian Avery recently, and yes, it is part of a series. Here is a novel by Evelyn Waugh. Scoop. I did not study this novel in undergrad in university, but I did study others by him. It was A Handful of Dust is the one I studied, and picked up a bunch more because I liked that one so much. I've recently reread A Handful of Dust and thought it had some major flaws, but was still a fascinating read. And this is just one that's about journalists. I believe it was published in the late 30s, but I'm having trouble reading that teeny tiny date on the copyright page. This is a pretty good condition Penguin edition. Let's hear the opening paragraph of this. While still a young man, John Courtney Booth had, as his publisher proclaimed, achieved an assured and enviable position in contemporary letters. His novels sold 15,000 copies in their first year and were read by the people whose opinions John Booth respected. Between novels, he kept his name sweet in intellectual circles with unprofitable but modish works on history and travel. His signed first editions sometimes changed hands at a shilling or two above their original price. He had published 8 books, beginning with The Life of Rimbaud, written when he was 18, and concluding at the moment with Waste of Time, a studiously modest description of some harrowing months among the Patagonian Indians, of which most people who lunched with Lady Metroland could remember the names of 3 or 4. He had many charming friends, of whom the most valued was the lovely Mrs. Algernon Stitch. Well, that's pretty inviting. Here is a Canadian novel by one of my favorite Canadian writers, based on having read maybe 2 of his books, and this is one of them, Nadine by Matt Cohen. I went to a reading that Matt Cohen gave in Edmonton in, I believe, 1990. He died not very many years afterwards, quite young. So I was so glad that I got a chance to hear him read. And this was the book that was, I believe this was the newest book that he had out at that time. I must confess I remember little about it except that I enjoyed it. I believe the protagonist is a Jewish woman, perhaps a Jewish Canadian woman, and that it has to do with the Holocaust. But I really want to reread it because that's about all I remember. And that might not even be accurate. More recently, I read Matt Cohen's The Sweet Second Summer of Kitty Malone, which in addition to being one of the best titles for a work of Canadian fiction, was an excellent novel, and much earlier. I look forward to rereading this book someday, and will certainly treasure the fact that I have an autographed copy from Matt Cohen. Here is a book, I believe it is part of the series of books that started with Things Fall Apart by the preeminent African novelist, Nigerian novelist, Chinua Achebe, Arrow of God, which I still haven't read, and I didn't even remember having a copy. Oh, you know what? I stand corrected. I started to read this novel. I don't think I finished it. And this is completely a new memory that has just surfaced because I flipped through it and saw some writing in the margin. I'm sure I didn't finish it, but this novel was one of the only fictional texts for my graduate course in post-colonial theory, and I hated the theory so much, not because of any political leanings or anything. It was just so abstruse. I couldn't stand it. It was the worst class I've ever taken, and I quit very early, but I read part of this novel. I'm sure I never finished it, and I had no memory of that until this moment. Here's the opening paragraph. This was the 3rd nightfall since he began to look for signs of the new moon. He knew it would come today, but he always began his watch 3 days early because he must not take a risk. In this season of the year, his task was not too difficult. He did not have to peer and search the sky, as he might do when the rains came. Then the new moon sometimes hid itself for days behind rain clouds, so that when it finally came out, it was already half grown. And while it played its game, the chief priest sat up every evening, waiting. And this is a mint condition copy of a Margaret Laurence novel, The Fire Dwellers. Look at that. Isn't that a gorgeous cover? And this is from the, sadly, no longer with us, New Canadian Library series that McClelland and Stewart put out. And I'm pretty sure I know where I got this. Just before I returned to university as an undergrad to get my honors degree in English, I signed up for a correspondence course in Canadian literature from Athabasca University. All their courses, or most of them, were on correspondence. And I started it, and I loved it. And then I made the decision to just go back to university, so I didn't finish that class. And they sent me all the books, and most of them were from the New Canadian Library. And I can tell, because there's no price tag or anything, and it's still in mint condition, that's how it came into my hands. I love Margaret Laurence. I've only read 2 of her books, The Stone Angel and Bird in the House. Want to read many more. And this is probably part of her Manawaka series. I'm just going to take a guess because she didn't write very much that wasn't. And this was originally published in 1969. Here is the opening paragraph, including some lyrics or a rhyme that comes just before the first paragraph, which is pretty essential to understanding the first paragraph. Ladybird, ladybird, fly away home. Your house is on fire, your children are gone. Crazy rhyme. Got it on the brain this morning. That's from trying to teach Jen a few human words yesterday. Why anybody would want to teach a kid a thing like that, I wouldn't know. Half those nursery rhymes are gruesome when you come to think of it. Here is a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a chopper to chop off your head. Just the thing to make the sprout sleep soundly, especially if followed by that prayer about if I should die before I wake. Maybe it's okay, though. Prepares them for what they can expect. Stacy, you sure are joyful first thing in the morning. First thing, hell. It's 8:45, and here's me not dressed yet. And here is a collection of short fiction by a writer that I believe lived at least part of her life in Saskatchewan, but at the time this was published, she lived in Ontario, and there is a very old sticker from a Toronto bookstore, This Ain't the Rosedale Library, that was one of my favorite bookstores when I lived just up the street in the gay ghetto of Toronto in the 90s. It is called Casino and Other Stories by Bonnie Burnard. She won the Governor General's Award for one of her books, I think. And this is a collection of her short fiction that I have not read. I read her earlier collection of short fiction, Women of Influence, which I loved, and that's why I got this. And all these years later, I think I'm finally going to read it. Bonnie Burnard passed on a year or two ago, I think. The opening story is called Crush. Let's hear the opening paragraph. It's Thursday morning and it's hot, hot, hot. The girl is painting the kitchen cupboards. The paint stinks up the room, stinks up the whole house. Her summer blonde ponytail and her young brown shoulders are hidden in the cupboards, and a stranger coming into the kitchen, seeing only the rounded buttocks and the terry cloth shorts and the long, well-formed legs, might think he was looking at part of a woman. Oh my, I'm not sure where the story's going to go from there, but that's pretty intriguing. I don't remember when, but it was probably in the 80s or certainly the 90s that I heard, and it might have been on Eleanor Wachtel's Writers and Company, but some radio program like that, I heard an interview with the Australian writer Elizabeth Jolley, and I started collecting her books. I didn't read any of her books, and I'm delighted to find two that I brought back to finally belatedly rectify that situation. So here is a lovely hardcover edition of a novel by Elizabeth Jolley called The Well, possibly published in 1986, but I can't read that. Let's hear the opening paragraph. One night, Miss Hester Harper and Catherine are driving home from a celebration, a party at the hotel in town, to which Miss Harper has been an unwilling guest. Catherine had wanted very much to go to the party. She is under the spell of a succession of film stars, the present one being John Travolta. She tries to walk exactly as he walks. Having seen every one of his films several times, she is able to imagine herself, when dancing, as his chosen perpetual partner. Miss Harper, unable to refuse Cathy anything, has endured a long evening bearing at least 2 insults. One of these because of the Peter Pan collar, laden with disturbing implication. She also suffered, during the evening's long, drawn-out entertainment, a renewal of the realization of her own changed status, brought about by recent events. Well, that is completely and utterly beguiling. Here is a lovely unread penguin. Unfortunately, it's got a really old price tag on it, of Colette, her novella called Gigi. I've never read, to this day, I've never read anything by Colette. Oh, it's actually Gigi and the Cat. 2 novellas, I guess. Translated by Roger Senhouse. It opens with dialogue, which doesn't probably have a standalone vitality, so I'll leave it at that. Quite a lovely copy, if I can get that old price tag off. This one is totally for sentimental reasons. This is the copy that I read for my undergraduate course in the Victorian novel of The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. And that's how I look after my books. That's how I've always looked after my books. This is the copy that I studied, and there isn't a crack in the spine. I've got a few underlinings in it, and it is an absolutely delightful novel. I read it in 1993, and I wanted to have this on my shelf. I'm not going to read the opening paragraph of Thomas Hardy. You've either already read the book or you don't probably care, and this video is going long, but I'm really looking forward to rereading this. Back to that correspondence course on Canadian literature that I didn't finish. Here's another pristine copy of a book that was on that syllabus. Ringuet, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, 30 Acres, a Quebec writer and novel, and it was translated by Felix and Dorothea Walter. I believe it was originally published in French in 1940. They're really attractive little paperback editions. This is a collection of short fiction by a Saskatchewan writer who, as far as I know... Editing's on here. Well, as far as I know, doesn't go very far. I got this writer completely mixed up with somebody else with a similar name. So this Elizabeth Brewster died in 2012, aged 90, and I'm editing out all the stuff I said about her that wasn't correct, and we'll just leave it at that. And here is a collection of hers from 1980, what is it? 1983. It's quite a beautiful cover, isn't it? A House Full of Women. The title story. Let's hear the opening paragraph. The grandmother, the mother, and the girl lived together in a white house with green trimmings on Charlotte Street in the little town of Milton. It was a smallish house, but comfortable enough. Downstairs, when you came in the front door and turned to the right, there was a room that was a combined parlor and dining room, with a heavy dark dining table and chairs, a large rocking chair for the grandmother, and a couch covered with flounced floral cretonne, on which the grandmother sometimes snoozed, or the girl sometimes curled up to read or study. On the other side of this room was the kitchen, with its wood stove and its sturdy deal table, covered with linoleum, off which they ate most of their meals, unless there was company or it was somebody's birthday. Many years ago, I think the very first year I was a booktuber, I did a reading collaboration with an Australian booktuber who has sadly long disappeared from booktube, of The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark. And I think I had a beat-up old copy of it that was the exact edition of this. This is my original textbook from the University of Saskatchewan back in the day, and that day was 1985. There's my English 275, 1985. One of my professors that I have talked about recently, about a year ago, seeing at a literary reading and having a wonderful conversation with, and this is the original copy. I'm not going to read from it. It's one of the best novellas published in the UK in the 20th century. I've talked many times about David Carpenter, one of my profs here in Saskatoon, who is still in Saskatoon. God's Bedfellows is a collection of his stories that I picked up, and I think I probably got it autographed, didn't I? I didn't. Well, I'll have to rectify that. Wow, look at him. Like myself, he doesn't have quite so much hair as he did in the late 80s. This was published in 1988. Here is the opening paragraph from the first story. The first story is called Crossing the Line. I used to tell this story during my drinking days down at the Athabasca. It was a good test of people's sobriety. The moderate drinkers would give me that, "Oh sure, Barney" look, and the drunks would grow wide-eyed with belief and make me feel for a while like a prophet. I've told two people this story when I was completely sober, my wife Molly and my younger brother Darrell. Molly took the diplomatic approach and said there were certainly parts of it that rang true, but Darrell looked at me as if to say, "So that's where all that reading and education got you? You were always the one with the imagination," he said later. Spiritless little prig. Well, that's a microfiction in and of itself. What a fabulous opening paragraph. Speaking of stories, and speaking of Elizabeth Jolley, this is the other book of hers that I picked up over the years. It's called Stories by Elizabeth Jolley, and it was published in 1984. And I won't read from it. I've already given you a fabulous taste of Elizabeth Jolley, so we'll just let that suffice for the two of them. Here is a collection of interviews with Saskatchewan writers, Voices and Visions by Doris Hillis, that I picked up years ago, never ever looked at. It was published in 1985. And there are many writers in here that I know of or have read, including Lorna Crozier, Patrick Lane. They were a couple. Patrick Lane passed away a few years ago. Guy Vanderhaeg and Shumigalski, the poet. Yeah, there's a lot of names here that aren't as familiar to me, so that'll be an interesting read at some point. Another one by David Carpenter. 2 novellas, Jokes for the Apocalypse. And this one was published by McClelland and Stewart. I don't think many of his were published by a national publisher, but I may be wrong about that. And it's also not signed. It was published in 1985. The first novella is called Luce, L-U-C-E, if I'm pronouncing it right. And let's hear the opening paragraph of that. In the winter of 1936, my father's plane went down on a vast lake somewhere north of Whitehorse. There were 3 in the plane. The pilot was a man named Walmsley. He was badly hurt on impact when the plane skidded across the lake and crashed into a snow-covered rock on the shore of a small island. Apparently this man died a day or 2 later. This left father and a Cree Indian named Amos Whitehawk, who had surveyed with my father for several months. Both escaped from the plane with a few cuts and bruises. Well, that's an attention-getting opening. I think this might be one of the very first books that I ever got signed by the writer. And it was signed on November the 13th, 1991 in Saskatoon. I had just moved back to Saskatoon from Edmonton to do my honors degree in English literature. And Nino Ricci, who I can't remember if he'd already won the Governor General's Award that year or not, but he came to Saskatoon and did a reading, and it was one of the very first readings I ever went to. Lives of the Saints by Nino Ricci. It's a wonderful novel. It came out in 1990, so he had probably won the Governor General's Award by then. Opening paragraph. It's short and fabulous. If this story has a beginning, a moment at which a single gesture broke the surface of events like a stone thrown into the sea, the ripples cresting away endlessly, then that beginning occurred on a hot July day in the year 1960 in the village of Val de Sol, when my mother was bitten by a snake. Oh, it's such a good novel. An Alberta writer, Henry Kreisel, The Betrayal, and I haven't read this, but I bought it because I read his most well-known novel, The Rich Man. I don't remember anything about that novel, but I remember other than that I thought it was excellent. And this is another novel by him from 1964. Here's the opening paragraph. Now, when I look back, it seems strange that I should have got involved with Theodore Stapler at all. The affair began, as such affairs have a habit of doing, in the most casual way, simply because I noticed that one of my students, an alert and intelligent girl, good-looking too, I might say, not perhaps beautiful, but certainly striking, was not doing as well as she had been doing in the first term. There was, after the Christmas vacation, a noticeable falling off in her work. Well, there's an old poop straight man vibe about that, but I'm hoping there's more to it than that. Aretha Van Herk is an Alberta writer that I've never read, and this is one of her more well-known novels called The Tent Peg. Her most well-known novel is, I think, Judith. Although No Fixed Address is also well-known. This first came out in 1981. I have no idea why I had this book of Sappho's poetry, but I did, and I recently read a fabulous novel by Lynn something Schwartz called After Sappho, which sparked an interest in me to read Sappho's poetry. So when I saw this, not having any memory that I had it on my shelf back in the day, I picked it up. Here is another novel by Evelyn Waugh, Decline and Fall. I haven't read it. I believe it was published in 1928, if I can read that small print. I think some of the themes in this novel are decline and fall. 5 stories by Willa Cather. A little bit of an old copy of it. I might have bought this one because it has one of her most popular works of short fiction, Paul's Case. And Paul's Case is about a gay man. That's all I have ever heard about it. I don't think I've read it. So let's hear the opening paragraph of Paul's Case. It was Paul's afternoon to appear before the faculty of the Pittsburgh High School to account for his various misdemeanors. He had been suspended a week ago, and his father had called at the principal's office and confessed his perplexity about his son. Paul entered the faculty room suave and smiling. His clothes were a trifle outgrown, and the tan velvet on the collar of his open overcoat was frayed and worn. But for all that, there was something of the dandy about him, and he wore an opal pin in his neatly knotted black four-in hand and a red carnation in his buttonhole. This latter adornment the faculty somehow felt was not properly significant of the contrite spirit befitting a boy under the ban of suspension. Well, yes, I need to read that story, if nothing else. Here is one that, again, I just needed to have on my shelf for sentimental reasons. This is my first Anthony Trollope, and it's the exact edition that I read as an undergrad. Anthony Trollope's Is He Popenjoy? Pretty obscure, but it's really good, and I really want to reread it. I studied that in 1993. The first paragraph of chapter 1 is too long, but it's wonderful. I must have thought so back in the day because I've underlined half of it. I think maybe because it was my first, it's still my favorite, I think. Here is a novel by Audrey Thomas, Graven Images. It was published in 1994. I heard her read in Toronto, but I don't know why this isn't signed. I have some of her books signed, but this was maybe the very next novel that she published after I heard her read. It's about a mother and a daughter sailing to England. I didn't ever read it. Audrey Thomas, I think she was born in America, lived most of her adult life in Canada, and currently lives on Salt Spring Island, one of the islands off the coast of Vancouver Island. And she's still alive, the last I checked, in her 80s. I really have a soft spot for her writing. Here's the opening paragraph. There was rubble everywhere along Euston Road and King's Cross Road, and metal signs twisted and crumpled into odd shapes. October 16th, 1987. Trees with their Medusa roots showing. Broken pavement. Danger signs. Keep clear. I had twisted my ankle the night of the captain's farewell party, and I walked carefully so as not to twist it again. Here is something that I had no memory of having. Maybe it was actually on the syllabus for my Irish Lit course that I took as an undergrad, but in any event, I certainly didn't ever crack it. A Concise History of Ireland by Mayer and Conor Cruise O'Brien. Conor Cruise O'Brien is a name that's very familiar to me. I think it might have been a book that was one of my textbooks for my Irish Lit class that I never ever looked at, and now I might. Another book on the syllabus for the correspondence course in Canadian literature. Another New Canadian Library edition, Howard O'Hagan, Tay John. It was first published in 1960, and it's set in Western Canada. Alberta, perhaps. Here is a fairly nice copy of The Professor's House, and I'm not even sure if I read this. I'm pretty sure it was on the syllabus for my grad course in James Wharton and Cather, but I can't remember if I ever read it. It looks like I might have. I've written my name in it, which is usually a sign that I've read it. And again, she's pretty canonical, so I'll just leave it at that. But if I don't remember whether or not I've read it, I better read it. Here is, I think, the book by Henry Kreisel that I have read. The Rich Man. This is a beat-up, older edition from New Canadian Library, not nearly as attractive as the other ones I've been showing off to you. And it was published in 1948. Here is the opening paragraph. When Jacob Grossman woke up and looked at the clock which was standing on a chair beside his bed, his first thought was that he should have been at work half an hour ago. But then he remembered that he hadn't set the alarm last night. He had a special thing to do, and he wanted to do it in a special way. He would get down to the factory about 11 and go straight to Mr. Duncan's office. "Mr. Duncan," he would say, shaking the manager's hand. "Mr. Duncan." And then what? How would he go on? It was difficult to find the right words. If he could talk to him in Yiddish, everything would be fine. But in English? I don't remember if I've read this or not. That's a pretty intriguing opening. Here is a book from my Western Canadian Lit class with David Carpenter, Frederick Philip Grove's Fruits of the Earth. And this was one of the first novels I read about homesteaders in Western Canada, and it just kind of opened my eyes to my own family history. I can't remember. I think he was German-Canadian, and because of anti-German sentiment, he adopted the pseudonyms. I want to read more by him because this was so good. It was originally published in 1933. That's all I'll say, because I'm running out of I've been talking too long, but I really want to reread this one. And finally, the last book is a collection of short stories by Matt Cohen, who I've shown one of his novels earlier in the video. I have not read this. Living on Water. Here's the opening paragraph from the first story. The title of the first story is Lives of the Mine Slaves. When sandstorms, freezing cold, or sudden bursts of rain caused Nellie to cough or hesitate, Norman would caress the steering wheel and murmur encouragingly, "Come on, Nellie, you can make it, Nellie." Or in desperate circumstances, "Nellie Bell, honey, I love you." Nellie was a 1962 Ford V8. In her youth she had been maroon, a dark lustrous red endowed with flowing curves and a motor that could snap your neck back when you pressed her pedal to the floor. Those had been Nellie's salad days, the days and nights of her first youth, the years of careful washes and hand-shining, valve jobs and cylinder refittings, the days when her engine always hummed with clear, creamy oil, and when her evenings were spent at drive-in movies, her springs gently rocking. Oh, I gotta get to this one soon. Well, I've given you samples of most of these. Which one strikes your fancy? Thanks for watching.